This story took place in late 2020, in the months of the COVID lockdown in the UK. It occurred in the town of Renfrew near Glasgow Airport. On this cold, frosty evening, my friend Kieran, who was in her late 20s, was on her way to work in her family's Indian restaurant, which was one of the staples of the Fenru area prior to the pandemic. Everyone in the area knew the restaurant, and it was something her family were extremely proud of. Kieran would work evenings there with her brother and sister. During this time, road closures meant the restaurant could only be accessed from her house via a quieter back road. Her neighbor was a man in his 50s and began renting the house next door to Kieran's family the year before. They didn't really know anything about the neighbor. However, recently, Kieran had noticed this house guest would stare at her in an inappropriate manner when she would be leaving or entering her family house. He made her feel uneasy, and she always felt anxious when she knew he was outside. On this occasion, while she exited the house, he, for the first time, actually spoke directly to her, and what he said made her skin crawl. "Hey, Miss Chahal, my name's Alec. I just want to say, you look amazing in those leather trousers." Kieran wore these because she felt they kept her warm in the frosty weather. The fact he said this to her and the way he delivered was inappropriate, and when she glanced at him, she told him. He was looking her up and down like she was a piece of meat. She didn't reply to him and was just in shock. How the heck can this be the first thing you ever say to someone, she thought. She jumped back into her car and felt like she was going to throw up as he was still glaring at her with a blank expression, and she said it was as though he was incapable of blinking. This felt as though it lasted forever, and it got even worse when she realized she had to defrost the car windscreen and windows. Her parents and siblings were already working at the restaurant, so she had no one in the house she could turn to make her feel safe. She then came to an even worse realization: she didn't have her phone. She sat in the car debating with herself whether to get it or leave, as she would need it later in the night at the restaurant. She decided she would quickly run and get it. Kieran jumped quickly out the car and ran inside, and she realized Alec wasn't standing there anymore. This filled her with relief, as it meant she wouldn't have to hear another inappropriate comment or see another inappropriate look from him. She unlocked the house and went inside. She was there for maybe 30 seconds, picked up her keys and went to leave again, when she heard a noise at the front door. The house was fairly dark, so this filled her with dread. It didn't seem as though anything was there, so she put this down to nerves after her incident with Alec. Kieran locked up the house and got back in her car, and she then began to drive to the restaurant. As mentioned, this was out in a quiet area due to road closures, so there weren't really many cars around or people due to the pandemic. After driving for about 2 minutes out of the residential area, she realized her car started to struggle. She stopped the car, got out, and realized her back left tire was flat. But to her horror, it wasn't just flat, it had been slashed. She had her mobile phone in her hand. That was when a car, from out of nowhere, came up from behind her with its full beam lights on. Kieran was practically blinded by this, and she had to turn away from the lights. And after a few seconds, she heard the other car's door slam, and all of a sudden, a strong, gloved hand suddenly clamped tightly over her mouth. Kieran said tears began to fill her eyes. The panicked breath coming from her nose was visible in the frost, and her lips began to quiver behind the gloved hand, but she was too shocked to even attempt to scream or bite it. What happened next was the most horrifying moment of her life. She heard a familiar voice say, "Right, Mr. Hal. Hands behind the back." It was Alec. She was so confused, but in her state of shock and fear, she put her hands behind her back, and the gloved hand was removed from her mouth but replaced with a rag. Kieran then heard the familiar sound of parcel tape being pulled, and her hands were taped behind her back. Alec then turned Kieran around to face him. She was backed up against the boot of her car. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she was forced to look into his eyes. He took the rag out of her mouth, and then put a long strip of parcel tape across her mouth. She began mumbling and pleading against the tape that was gagging her. Alec then leant down and taped her feet together. As the brown parcel tape was covering Kieran's mouth, the breath from her nose looked like steam from a kettle on this now freezing night, and Alec walked around the front of the car and switched the engine off. While he walked to the car, Kieran noticed he hadn't taped her feet together as well as her hands and mouth, so she managed to kick her leg hard enough to break free. As Alec returned to the back of the car, not knowing Kieran had freed her legs, he was stunned with a swift kick from Kieran, as well as a loud, mumbled grunt connected with his groin area. He screamed and bent over, and then Kieran kicked him as hard as she could in the face, knocking him completely to the ground. Kieran then rubbed the tape from her mouth against her shoulder until she peeled it off. She then leaned against her car boot and managed to step backwards, so her taped hands were now in front of her, and she chewed at the parcel tape until they were free. It took her a few moments now that her mouth was free to catch her breath. She then grabbed her phone, which had fallen, and that was when Alec grabbed her. She called the police and then her family at the restaurant. Alec was arrested and taken away. He was charged and found guilty of attempted kidnapping and physical assault. It also emerged that Alec was staying in the neighbor's house without his knowledge. Kieran's neighbor had been staying with a family because of the pandemic, so Alec had actually been illegally staying there. As you can probably guess, Alec wasn't his real name. He knew Kieran's name because he'd been looking at the deliveries while he was sitting outside. Kieran began taking martial art lessons a few months before this incident, and she believes that this might be what saved her. She has moved on from this traumatic experience with a lot of counseling and therapy. Her family's restaurant, unfortunately, was sold during the pandemic. However, the main thing for them is that Kieran is safe and well. Me and my husband's first house was on a pretty busy suburban street. It was a small 3-bedroom place in a part of town that wasn't exactly great, but it was what we could afford at the time, and we were just happy to have something of our own. I had just had my first baby, and was already pregnant with my second, and life was now hectic and exhausting. The layout of our house is simple. Our bedroom was at the very end of a narrow hallway towards the back, and my son's room was the first door off that hallway, right near the living room and kitchen. I remember that night pretty clearly, because it started like so many others. My son woke up crying sometime in the middle of the night, and I got up to settle him while my husband stayed asleep in our room, completely out of it. I climbed into my son's small bed with him, holding him close and trying to calm him down. Eventually he settled, his breathing slowing, and I just stayed there beside him, too tired to make the walk back down the hallway. The house was completely still, and that's when I heard heavy footsteps coming from the direction of the living room. It wasn't the soft creak of someone walking barefoot, or even the normal sound of someone getting up in the night. These were like heavy boots hitting the floor. I remember frowning, confused more than anything at first. I hadn't heard my husband get out of bed, and even if he had, why would he be wearing boots in the middle of the night? The sound didn't match anything that made sense. The footsteps got closer, then stopped right outside my son's door. The door was shut. I held my breath, and suddenly I was very aware of how quiet everything else had become. My son was asleep beside me, completely unaware, and I was just laying there in the dark, staring at the door. I called out my husband's name a little louder, to no reply. That's when the confusion turned into fear, because right after I called out, I heard a faint sound on the other side of the door. Not movement exactly, more like a light knock. Soft, hesitant nearly. And underneath it, there was a whispering sound. I couldn't make out any words, just the low murmur of a voice. And every part of me went frigid. At that point, my mind jumped to the only explanation I could handle in that moment. I told myself it had to be something else, something not real, because the idea of an actual person standing on the other side of that door was too much to consider. The house was older, and I had heard plenty of stories growing up. Lying there in the dark, listening to something I couldn't explain, it felt easier to believe it was something supernatural than something real. And after a few seconds, them felt way longer than they should have, the knocking ceased, and I heard the footsteps again moving away from the door and back down the hallway towards the front of the house. I neither moved nor got up. I didn't open the door, but just stayed there frozen, listening until the sound faded away, and everything went quiet again. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I convinced myself it had to have been my husband, that maybe I was just half asleep and imagining things, and that I was overthinking it. I stayed in my son's bed and somehow managed to fall asleep. In the morning, everything felt normal at first. My husband was up, completely unaware of anything that had happened during the night, and I asked him if he'd gotten up at all, if he had gone down the hallway, or if he had come to our son's room. And he looked at me like I was crazy. He, of course, hadn't moved all night, and that uneasy feeling came rushing back immediately and now stronger than before. I didn't even say anything else to him at first. I just walked down the hallway towards the front of the house, and that's when I saw that the front door was wide open. I'm not talking about unlocked. I'm talking about 100% fully open, and the realization hit me all at once, and it made everything from that night snap into place in the worst possible way. It wasn't my husband, or my imagination, or anything harmless. Someone had been inside our house. They had walked down the hallway, right up to my son's door, and stood there listening, maybe even watching. And then, for reasons I'll never know, turned and left. And somehow my husband slept through all of it. That part still bothers me as much as the rest. Just how quiet it must have been, how careful the person was moving through our home. We never found out who it was or why they came in, and nothing was taken as far as we could tell. But after that night, I never ignored sounds in the dark again. Back in 2013, I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and I had moved there for a new job. It was just me living there in a quaint and spacious townhouse with my then 4-year-old daughter. We were relatively new to the area and didn't know many people, but did become familiar with the kind older gentleman who lived next door. His name was Ben. We lived in a connected townhouse with our 2 units abutting each other. Our street was lined with beautiful floral trees and was quite nice, but Providence is weird in that the conditions of the houses and little neighborhoods can vary drastically street by street. We were near a few rough neighborhoods, but I felt relatively safe in my new home. I remember a few nights prior to this specific night, I saw a Facebook post with a safety tip to put your car keys next to your bedside if anything ever happens. You can press the alarm and scare off an intruder. I've never been overly concerned about my safety and rarely took advantage of any tips I saw on Facebook, so I'm not sure how or why I suddenly decided to heed this advice. I was reading a book in bed with my light on in the second-floor bedroom, hours after putting my daughter to sleep. when I heard a loud sound outside. I peered out the window. I had taken some melatonin that evening, turned off the light and went to sleep. It was maybe half an hour later or so when I was suddenly woken by what felt like almost an earthquake. The room shook, and I heard a loud thud. Half awake, I gasped and sat up, wondering if it was my imagination or if I actually felt something, and immediately ran to my daughter's room, thinking she had fallen off her bed or injured herself or something. As I swung her door wide open, there she was, sleeping soundly and sweetly. I was so confused. I heard another loud bang and had this eerie feeling that something was wrong but couldn't quite figure out what. I grabbed my car key fob and took it downstairs and nervously inspected the first floor. I swore to myself that if I heard one more sound I would press the alarm just in case, but I didn't. It was silent after that. I returned to bed, and it took a while for me to fall asleep again, but soon I shut my eyes. The next day went on like any other day. That's when I noticed a friend of mine had repeatedly called me in the afternoon. I picked up my daughter from preschool and called the friend back. "Did you hear that?" he said. "No, what?" I answered. "News outlets were mobbing your street an hour ago and there were news trucks in your driveway." I sat silent and confused. 3 men broke into your neighbor's place last night, tied him up at gunpoint and stole thousands of dollars worth of items and took off in his car. I immediately fell to my knees and began to sob. I had heard it all happen. I almost pressed the button. But I didn't. I felt completely unsafe. I asked a friend to come over for the night to stay with us, and it wasn't until the next day I got a chance to speak to Ben. Ben explained the whole story and told me the cops wanted to talk to me so I could share what I had heard and experienced. He said the men smashed the window in his basement and entered through there. That's the sound I heard before going to bed. Apparently the timeline suggested that they saw my light and me peering out the window and waited half hour or so until my light was out to enter the premises. They didn't realize he was home, and since he had gone to bed early that night, it was suggested that they cased his place beforehand. He had been asleep when one of them was rummaging through his upstairs room, which was directly on the other side of my closet and shared wall. The sounds and shakes I heard and felt were apparently the intruder knocking him down to the ground after realizing Ben was there and cupping his mouth to tell him if he made another sound he would kill him. This was why I never heard another sound, as I was investigating thereafter. After they tied him up, he remained tied up for over 12 hours, until he eventually broke free and called the police. I cried again, apologizing profusely to Ben and explained what I had heard, and he simply said that as he was tied up, all he could think about was he was glad it didn't happen to me and my little girl. I really don't know what I would have done if my daughter and I had to experience that level of trauma firsthand. Ben seemed to be okay considering it all, but it took me so long to feel safe again and for the guilt to subside. They never caught those guys, and I ended up ordering a taser, which was illegal, and some mace, and even for the first time in my life considered getting a gun, but in the end decided against it. I've been fortunate to never experience anything close to that again, and certainly don't want to. I'm glad Ben was ultimately okay, but next time I'll listen to my instinct. It's better to be safe than sorry. And to the men who tied up and robbed my old neighbor at gunpoint, let's not meet. This happened back in 2015, when I was 16 years old. It was the middle of summer, and both my parents had gone out to visit relatives and weren't going to be back for 3 days. And since I was an only child, that of course meant I was completely alone. Technically I could take care of myself just fine, but my grandma still came by every day to make me lunch. No one asked her to do that, that's just how she is. She'd show up, cook something, and sit with me for a bit before heading out again. But Once night came around, it was just me alone in the house, and I would do what any 16-year-old would do. Stay up way too late, either watching movies, random YouTube videos, or gaming. The first night went by without anything weird happening, and the second night is when things got bad. I was in the living room watching a movie, completely relaxed. It must have been around midnight or something. I was eating some snacks, and I paused the movie and got up to go to the kitchen to grab some more. Now, the layout of the house is important here. The kitchen is separate from the living room, and the front door is closer to the living room area. From the kitchen doorway, you can't fully see the front door unless you lean out a bit, and the stairs to the second floor are right near that same area. I had just stepped into the kitchen and was grabbing another bag when I heard glass breaking. It was a loud and sharp sound, followed immediately by the front door opening. For a second, my brain didn't even process it properly. It felt unreal. And then, the truth sunk in. I froze for about 2 seconds and then my body moved on instinct. I grabbed the closest knife from the kitchen counter without even thinking about it and slowly crept towards the doorway so I could peek into the living room area. When I leaned out just enough to see him. He was tall, easily around 6 feet, maybe a little more, wearing a baseball cap pulled low and an old jacket. He wasn't being quiet at all. He was going through a shelf near the door, moving things around, opening drawers, and making noise like he didn't expect anyone to be there. That detail is probably the only reason I'm okay. My phone was upstairs in my room, and for some reason in that moment, my only thought was that I needed to get it. From where I was standing, the stairs were just to the right of my doorway. If I could get past him without being noticed, I could run upstairs, lock myself in my room and call the police. Looking back, that was a stupid plan. However, at the time, it honestly felt like my only option. And so I started moving slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. My heart was pounding so loud I was convinced he'd hear it. Somehow I made it to the stairs without him noticing. I was just about to step up when he turned around, and our eyes instantly locked. I don't even remember deciding to do it, but I screamed this loud, aggressive yell and threw the knife straight at him. I missed. It hit the wall right next to his head, and it was embedded in there. But that seemed to have done the trick, because the combination of the scream and a knife flying at him must have completely thrown him off, because his whole demeanor changed in a second. He didn't come towards me. He didn't say anything. He turned and bolted straight out the way he'd come in. For a split second, I'm not even sure what I was going to do. And then the adrenaline kicked in even harder, and instead of calming down like a normal person, I ran back to the kitchen to grab another knife. I don't know what I thought I was going to do if he came back, but in that moment, I felt like I had to be ready for anything. When I realized he was actually gone, I ran upstairs to my room, locked the door, and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial, but I managed to call the police and explain the events of that night. They got there pretty quickly. By then I was still shaking and replaying everything in my head. They checked the house, took fingerprints, and looked at the broken window and gathered whatever evidence they could. One of them asked me to walk them through exactly what happened, and I remember pointing to the knife still stuck in the wall. And the next morning I called my parents. They came back earlier than planned, around noon, no surprise there, and the first thing they saw when they walked in was the knife that was still lodged in the wall near the door. We ended up replacing the front door with something a lot sturdier after that. As for the guy, The police caught him within the same week. One of the officers later told me that when they picked him up, he claimed that I had tried to kill him, and he was the one who felt threatened. Apparently, from his perspective, he broke into what he thought was an empty house and suddenly got a knife thrown at him by a screaming kid. So yeah, if there's any kind of takeaway from this, it's probably that if someone breaks into your house, the smartest thing to do is hide and call for help, or, apparently, act completely unhinged and hopes it scares them off. I was sitting in the library across the road from my apartment that night. I was trying to get some work done and enjoy the quiet of the library. I believe it was quite late. My phone was on silent next to me, face down on the table, in order to not distract me, and I didn't notice it vibrating until it had already gone off a few times. When I finally picked it up, I saw missed calls from my flatmates, which is weird enough on its own as they usually just text. Before I could even think about it, my phone started ringing again, and I answered. The second I picked up, one of them was practically screaming, "Is that you in your room right now?" For a second I didn't even understand the question. I remember laughing a little confused and saying, "No, I'm in the library, why?" There was a pause, and then another person jumped in, my other roommate, her voice shaking. "There's someone in your room. We can hear them walking around. We're yelling at them to leave, but we're not opening the door." Everything in my body seemed to drop. I didn't ask any more questions, I just grabbed my stuff and ran. The library was across the road, and I don't think I've ever sprinted that fast in my life. My heart was pounding, and mine racing through every possible scenario, none of them good. I kept thinking about the fact that my room was at the front of the apartment, and that if someone was in there, they had already made it inside. So I got to the building, rushed upstairs, and threw the front door open and went straight in, calling out. But there was no response. My flatmates were still locked in their bedroom, and I could hear them crying and talking to each other through the door. I checked my room, expecting, well, I'm not entirely sure what, but it was empty. Drawers were slightly out of place, a few things had been moved around, but no one was there. Whoever it was had already left. My flatmates finally come out once they realized I was inside, and they were both shaking. They told me they had heard clear footsteps in my room, like someone moving around. They had screamed at whoever it was to get out over and over, but were too terrified to open their door and actually confront them. And that's what probably saved us, because not long after we found out where he went. He had gotten into the apartment next door and attacked a woman while she was in bed. I don't even know how to properly explain the feeling of hearing that. It was like everything hit at once. How close it was. How easily that could have been one of us instead. How the only reason he left our place was because he got spooked by my flatmates yelling. We were three 19-year-old girls living in an apartment with a front door we hadn't even bothered to lock that night. When the police came, they were professional, but there was a very clear edge to their tone when they talked to us, and we got a pretty harsh lecture about basic safety, locking doors and not making it easy for someone to just walk in. At the time, it almost felt unfair. Like we were already shaken enough, but upon reflection they weren't wrong. We had been careless, and were very fortunate. I still don't know what happened to that woman in the next apartment. We never got a full update, just bits and pieces, and honestly, I don't know if I ever want to know the full story. Oh, and this all happened on October 31st, and while everyone else was out having fun, wearing costumes and stuff, we were sitting there realizing just how real and close true danger had come to us. This happened in 2013, when I was 17. My family was looking at this house, and the owner showed up, and talked with my parents. He seemed like a nice older man, built the house himself. It was a pretty nice 2-story house overlooking a river. Anyway, I was standing back, watching everyone talk. As the owner is talking and laughing, there's a break in the conversation where he turns away from my parents, and his expression completely and instantly changes from happy to the most sinister and hateful scowl I've ever seen. I don't think he noticed me watching. I probably appeared to be on my phone as my head was down. As soon as he turned back, he instantly went back to smiling. It was so creepy, it honestly made me feel sick. I told my mum, who said it was weird, but maybe he was just awkward. We got the house. We moved in the next weekend and my family was going to church, but I for one didn't feel like going, so they left me home alone. It was Sunday morning at about 11 a.m. when I heard a really loud banging outside. It was coming from this side of the house. I was on the other side on the second floor. Honestly, my dumb ass thought maybe it was the wind, and I didn't think much of it. It stopped after about 5 minutes, and 10 minutes later, I hear walking around downstairs. Chairs moving, kitchen cabinets opening, as well as the fridge. I immediately quietly go to lock my door, grab my baseball bat, and call 911 while I tell them my address. I text my mum and tell her that someone's in the house and that I've dialed 911. At that point, the operator said that there was someone 10 minutes out. I told her because I heard steps walking towards the stairs. Basically, the house is so thin, I could track where he was in the house. At this point, my mum responds that she's on her way. She was half an hour away. So here's a 17-year-old girl, 5'2" and 100 pounds, hunkered in her room, knowing full well that if he came in, he'd overpower me and take the bat, and I was absolutely terrified. I heard him walk down the hallway towards my door. I saw the handle turn and stop. It was locked, and I heard him stand there. He didn't move. I could hear his breathing, and it felt like forever, but I think it was only about 10 seconds. Then I heard him turn and go back down. I heard the back door open and shut, and about 3 minutes later the police pulled up. The 911 operator asked me if I could let them in or if they needed to force it. I knew he had left, so I let them in. No one was there and there was no sign of forced entry. When my mum got there, she looked at my stepdad and asked if he'd changed the locks. Of course, he hadn't. I think the creepiest part, and what really validated my story, was that Mum had just vacuumed the hallway, and there were shoe prints that were larger than anyone in our house, and the police hadn't been up there, and they stopped just outside my room. He died a year after that. Please, people, don't forget to change your locks. I was around 16 when this happened. I was home with my mom and my younger sister. It was just a normal evening. It must have been around 10 p.m. when I decided to go up to the attic to grab some snacks that we kept stored up there. Now, our attic wasn't anything fancy. It was just a cramped space with boxes and old furniture, and a small window that we usually left slightly ajar to let in air in order for it to circulate. I remember kneeling down, digging through a box, not really paying attention to anything else, when I heard a noise. It sounded like footsteps right beneath the window. I froze instantly. Now, of course, when you hear footsteps, you can't just brush it off and assume it was an animal. It sounded too distinctly like someone running on 2 legs. And the thing that made it worse was the layout of our property. We had a tall concrete fence surrounding the entire place, not something you can just casually climb over without any effort. And on top of that, we had cameras installed with motion detection that would alert us to any movement around the house. And yet, I hadn't seen or heard anything before that moment. My first instinct was pure panic. I got up, rushed downstairs, and immediately started locking doors and windows. My mind was already jumping to the worst case scenario. Then I went straight to my mum and told her what I'd heard. She didn't believe me at first, or at least tried not to. She brushed it off and said I was overreacting, perhaps hearing something outside and letting my imagination run wild. But I insisted. Eventually, she agreed to come up to the attic with me. This time we turned the light off and just stood there in the dark listening. And for a few moments there was nothing, but then it happened again. The same fast footsteps right below the window, like something sprinting past the house. And after that, my mum didn't question it further. She immediately turned and rushed downstairs, grabbed my sister, and locked themselves in one of the bedrooms. I could hear the fear in her voice. Meanwhile, I reacted in a completely different way. I have always been into self-defense, collecting knives and gear, and instead of hiding, went straight to my room, grabbed my largest knife, a tanto blade easily over 40 centimeters, and at the time it felt like the only logical thing to do. And around the same time, the motion sensor light outside started turning on, one by one. First, near the side of the house, then the backyard, then near the front. Each light flicked on in sequence meant that something was moving around the perimeter. And adrenaline took over. I ran outside with the knife, shouting into the darkness and threatening whoever was out there. I remember yelling that I'd kill anyone on the property, and my voice echoed louder than I expected in the still night air. I circled the entire house, blade in hand, checking every corner and blind spot along the fence, expecting at any moment to see someone or something standing there. But regardless of how much I circled, I never found anyone at all. The lights eventually stopped triggering and everything went quiet again, and I went back inside, but none of us slept much that night. My mum stayed locked in the room with my sister, and I stayed awake. To this day I can't explain it. Maybe it was someone who somehow got in and out without being seen. Maybe the cameras missed something. Or maybe there's a rational explanation I haven't figured out yet. But me and my mum know what we heard. And whatever was running didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a human. I guess it's probably for the best that I didn't have to confront whoever it was, because in my crazed state of panic, I might have actually used that knife on another human being. I want to start by saying that this isn't the first bad experience I've had with dog sitting, but it definitely is the worst. I started dog sitting back when I was 13 and made good money doing it. I'm currently 19, and this happened when I was 18. I set up an easy way for people to contact me about dog sitting. I put out posts on Facebook and Instagram about it often, and would get people in my messages asking to dog sit. I got a notification from Instagram one day stating someone was trying to message me. I accepted it, and their message said something like, "Me and my wife are looking to find a dog sitter while we go away for a week to Florida. You'll have to work from the 14th to the 11th this month. We will pay you $300 for the week. You're welcome to stay at our house or go back to your own home." I started talking back and forth with this man. So let's call him Mr. Brown for privacy, and I agreed to take the gig and told him I would stay at his house for the whole week. Once I got to his house, I was introduced to his two dogs, Mina and Leddy. Mina was a little Yorkshire and Leddy a blue hound. I was shown around his house, which was surrounded by 76 acres. I live in a farm town and live on 32 acres myself, so staying here didn't really freak me out. The closest neighbors were pretty far away, and you would actually have to drive there if you wanted to talk to them. They told me the rules and when to feed them. Then Mrs. Brown told me about the nearest neighbor. In her words, she was a nice person, just a little drugged up and confused. She mentioned how sometimes she would pull up into their driveway instead of hers, and would end up mistaking Mrs. Brown for her deceased daughter. Hearing this made me feel pretty bad for her, and I knew all too well how hard it is for parents to lose their children, because of how my parents were after losing my brother in a car accident. Mrs. Brown said she shouldn't do anything bad, though if she came up to the house to just point her back to her home, and she should leave without any problems. After they left, I was down to watch movies and just chill with the dogs. The first 2 days were fine. On the third day, however, the old woman, who I'll call Mrs. Rose, did pull onto the driveway. I came outside as she was getting out of her car. She looked up to see me, and immediately she got back into her car and left. I chalked it up to her realizing it was the wrong house when she saw me and went back inside. Later that night, though, I got a call from Mrs. Brown asking if I was okay. I told her I was and asked why. She then went on to tell me that she got a call from Mrs. Rose and that she thought there was a robber in their house. I explained what happened, and she just laughed and said she must have been confused and forgot that we were out of town. I ended the phone call making a note to go over there tomorrow to clear the air about me being a robber. Once I went to bed that night, though, things got crazy. I woke up around 2 hearing a light scratching sound that almost sounded like tickling coming from outside the window. At first, I thought it might have been a bird or some sort of mighty creature and left it alone, but the noise kept me from falling back asleep. I wanted to scare it away, so I got up and went to open the blinds, but screamed when I lifted the blinds and the sight of Mrs. Rose trying to pry the window open with a pair of pliers. Once she saw me through, she started banging on the window with the pliers. The dog started barking now, and I quickly got up, told the dogs to follow me, grabbed my phone and ran into a room with no windows, which was the bathroom, locking the door in case she got in. I called 911 and explained the situation, quickly giving them the address from what I could remember, and she said the police would be there in 10 minutes, which is pretty good for the area considering how rural we were. I had gotten the dogs to be quiet and put them in the closet connected to the bathroom to make sure she didn't hear them. I was trying to stay calm and could hear the pounding on the window. As I continued to talk to the operator, I then heard the glass shatter. I cursed under my breath and tried not to cry. I was really scared and pretty much ready to cry from the fear of being beaten to death by someone who was clearly not in the right state of mind. I was whispering about what was happening to the operator hiding in the back bathroom of the tub. After about 4 minutes of pretty much silence, I heard footsteps and could see feet under the other side of the door and cursed myself again. I then see Miss Rose get on her hands to look underneath the crack, and I mistakenly let out a gasp. She gets up and quickly starts pounding on the door. I can tell she's still using the pliers, and at this point I'm crying, asking the operator where the police are, to which she responds, 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes felt like forever. I screamed at Miss Rose to please go away, and she screamed back that I shouldn't be there. Once, I heard the sound of police cars. About a minute later, they were trying to kick the door down. I was told to stay on the line until the intruder was caught, and that police were now trying to get into the house. Eventually, they did, and I yelled to get their attention, not that they needed it. She was still banging on the door. Once they got into the room, she was told to drop her weapon, and she obeyed, saying she didn't do anything wrong. They got her in cuffs, and a police officer told me it was okay to unlock the door, to which I slowly got up and unlocked it. After being taken to the police station and giving them my story for their report, I went to my parents' house. I was just too scared to be alone. The next day I called Mrs. Brown to explain the situation. I got full payment even after telling them I wasn't going back to the house. They called me a few days later, saying that Miss Rose was under the influence of drugs, and in her words, she told the police she decided to take care of the robber, me, herself, and that she did nothing wrong. She was charged with breaking and entering, which is kind of ironic, and after that I quit dog sitting, and am a lot more paranoid and always make sure my doors and windows are locked. I was living in the Fiji Islands back in 2016, and I was 14 years old. This story happened to my family, but mainly my mum lived it. It was on the 31st of October, and I was at my school for a Halloween-based party, and my parents and my little sister had gone to a family friend's Halloween party, so the house was empty. My party finished at 9 p.m, and my dad came to pick me up, but dropped off my mum and sister at the house because our security alarm was ringing. Because no one was home, my family obviously called the security company over, and they sent over a van with 3 security guards. My mum opens the house and lets everyone in. They check the whole house, and they see no one. My mother checks all the cupboards and under the bed with my little sister, who's only 12 at the time. The security go outside in the garden and in the basement to check if there's anyone, and it's not an accidental ring, as we don't have any pets. My mum turns on all the lights from the living room and balcony. She starts to open the window and the gates that protect all the windows to get to the balcony, when she looks at the keyhole and notices a flip-flop on the floor. She then looks closer, and she sees 2 pairs of legs hiding really close to each other against the wall under a garden sofa. My mum yells her lungs out. They were on the balcony. The 2 guys got scared and jumped off the balcony into my garden. One of the guards grabs the guy, but the second intruder jumps on the guard and they run away, jumping over the fence and into the forest. My mother regrets yelling, saying that if she had just gone down and spoken with security personally and quietly, they probably would have been caught. So there's my mother crying, holding my sister to her side and telling her everything will be okay. The security called the cops and did a report, describing the guys, and began a search. The cops were here in minutes, since I only live about 100 meters from the nearest station. The guys who jumped lost a hat there and flip-flops and left a sock, as well as gloves and 2 knives. Sadly, the guys were never found. 2 weeks later, my mum pulls out the driveway and looks in the rearview mirror of her car, and is 90% sure the 2 guys there opposite our house are staring at her. The short one had the same new hat, and the other guy had brand new flip-flops. When my mum drove away to the police station, the guys were gone, never to be found again. I got home after that with my dad, to my mum and sister crying. My dad was mad that he didn't stay. Luckily, my mum saw them before she opened the window. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened. Now, how did the 2 guys get onto the balcony? Well, it's going to sound stupid, but right next to the balcony where they were hiding, there are like 2 wooden poles linked together with a weird plank. My dad asked the landlord to be rid of it, but he didn't want to. It was convenient for me at the time because when I was 16, I'd climb onto the balcony and use the pole to sneak out and see my girlfriend at the time. And even though I did not live through this myself, it really scares me because I was young. And now that I live alone, I check the entirety of my house to make sure my house is always fully secure. So, to set the scene, I'm a 22-year-old female, and literally weeks from graduating from college and getting my bachelor's in theatre arts. I only have a quarter credit left to get, so I'm doing work in the theatre department costume shop to obtain that credit. It's not anything too difficult. I know how to both hand sew and use a sewing machine, so I've spent time doing both things and mending and adjusting garments for actors. The show is a musical, and there are some pretty intricate costumes, so I was excited to help out and get that final bit of credit to graduate. The costume shop opened for weekend hours at around noon, but I stayed up late on Friday night, so I woke up around 1. I got dressed and went to the costume shop as quickly as I could, since I wanted to get all the hours possible. Nothing was out of the ordinary, but as I was approaching the theatre building, something caught my eye. There was this guy standing off to the side of the front entrance. The front entrance is pretty open. It's this set of pillars, and then 3 sets of glass doors that are led up to by a set of stairs. Kind of Grecian, I guess. The building is an old one with an addition attached, that one containing the actual theatre, while the older building contains mainly classrooms. But this entrance is closest to the way I usually use to get backstage and into the costume shop. Anyway, the guy was kind of leaning against the stone side of the staircase. What caught my attention is that I go to school on a very small campus, so usually when I see someone I recognize their face, even if I don't know their name. I didn't recognize this guy at all. Physically, he wasn't overly weird looking, maybe a little disheveled. His hair was kind of greasy, and he had a t-shirt on and some tattered jeans. He looked college age, same as me. But what was even weirder was that he was wearing this heavy winter parka, even though it was nearly 65 degrees, as well as snow boots. We made eye contact and nothing immediately skeeved me out. I'm an awkward person, so I just kind of gave a polite nod and smile. I think that was my first mistake. He didn't smile back. In fact, his eyes followed me as I walked up the stairs and into the building. Super weird, but okay. My campus has some weirdos on it. I found that my school in particular seems to attract them, but I'm a senior, and I was pretty sure I had all the weirdos pretty much catalogued. Parker Guy was not among my mental catalogue of campus oddities. I got down to the costume shop, and I must have looked troubled, because the person who was already down there, someone I know on a somewhat personal level, greeted me, then asked if something was wrong. I told them about the guy, which somewhat amused them, and we speculated on who he could be for a while before they went up to check. Apparently, though, he was gone, as I was told when they got back. I worked on sewing literal halved beach balls onto bikini tops, and listened to a podcast. I got there at 1 and it was around 4:30 that the person that was with me left, leaving me alone. By this point I moved on from the tops and was sewing snaps onto the back of a blouse to make it fasten better. I took a break to work on a project due on Monday, then got back to sewing. My headphones were off this time as it was just me in the shop. For this next part, I'm going to have to give you a bit of an idea of the layout of the shop. It's in the basement of the building, and it is a bit hard to get to if you don't know your way around. The room is relatively large. It's sort of shaped like an irregular rectangle, but is separated by the tables set up in the middle of the room with the sewing machines on them. One side is way in from backstage behind the building's black box theatre, as well as the dressing rooms, and then the other side leads out into this sort of hallway that has doors leading to the auditorium, as well as an exit out of the building, if that makes any sense at all. That direction also leads to the main costume storage area. But anyway, near where the sewing machine tables are is this door that leads outside and into what the costume director refers to as the weird little courtyard. When I was a freshman, I took a class with her, and she warned us not to go out there since the door is locked from the outside, and if we go out there we won't be able to get back into the building. The courtyard is less of a courtyard, and more of some kind of area where there's a bunch of building machinery, like heating and cooling, as well as electrical stuff. It's all fenced in a chain link fence, about 15 feet high, but the door leading out there is one of those with a window. In this situation, I was sitting in a chair directly opposite this door, close to the wall across from it, so there was about maybe 20 odd feet of space between me and this door. It was nearing 6, but since the show's dress rehearsal started that Monday, I wanted to get as much done before I finished up and went for dinner. I was working on sewing the snaps onto the shirt when I heard a noise. It startled me, since I'd settled onto the rhythm of my task and listening to my podcast. It was still connected to the thread, so it wasn't lost, and I bent to pick it up from where it had fallen on the floor near my feet. It was when I lifted my head from that bent position that I saw the source of the noise. My vision was a little obscured because the space between me and the door was cluttered with a bunch of dresses from mannequins that me and the other members of the crew had been using to put costume pieces on. So it was more that I saw the door's window wasn't empty anymore. I shifted to the side a little to get a better look, and there, on the door leading out into the maintenance courtyard, was Parker Guy. The noise I heard had been him trying to open the door. I have no idea how he got there. That door is the only way into that courtyard, so I can only assume he somehow scaled a 15-foot fence. I froze like a deer in headlights, and for a moment, I was just still as he stared at me. And I stared back, his face expressionless. And it was as he continued to stare at me that I began to realize that this entire situation was wrong. I sort of settled back into my chair, unsure what to do. And it was in this handful of seconds that Parker Guy started trying the door again. It was, as I said before, locked, so he wasn't able to open it. Thank God. It's puzzling to me now that he didn't just come through the main entrance, as none of the doors leading down to the costume studio through the main entrance are locked. But maybe he tried that because, like I said, the studio is a little tricky to locate if you didn't know your way around the building. The only conclusion I could come to is that he tried what I mentioned just above, but couldn't find me, and then while wandering around the building, saw me through that door through the chain-link fence, and proceeded to scale it. Knowing this, I began to get scared. The door leading into the studio was to my left, and on instinct I got up to close it, since it locks from the inside and you need a key to reopen it. It was as I was moving closer to that door that the guy began to pound on the courtyard door. I don't know why my first instinct was to hide instead of opening the door I just closed and booking it, but I went into the small fabric storage room directly behind me, shut the door and called campus safety. I'm not really sure why I called them and not police, as the campus safety called them later anyway, but that's what I did. I don't know, people make decisions like that when they're scared. By the time campus safety came to investigate, which was pretty fast since I was clearly terrified on the phone, the guy was gone. I don't know how he scaled the fence again in the time it took them to arrive, but he had left. Campus safety escorted me back to my dorm and even went to the dining hall to pick me up some dinner since I was shaken, which I appreciated a lot. A while later, an officer came in to take my statement, since campus police called them. But as you can imagine, there wasn't much they could do apart from keep an eye out for this guy. I still have no idea who he was or why he was on campus, but it couldn't have been for a good reason. This happened to my family maybe 40 years ago. Back then, my dad lived in this house with his wife and my 2 half-siblings. It was a very difficult time. Robberies were happening all through the city, and in this area in particular, it had become quite dangerous. That morning, the cleaning lady was sweeping the sidewalk outside the house when some men approached her. I was told they grabbed her by the hair, dragged her inside, and slammed the gate shut. The house was on the upper floor. Below were the study and service room, and the men forced her up the stairs, opened the sliding balcony door, and entered the home. Inside were my dad's wife and my brother, who was 5 at the time. The intruders threatened them with guns and pointed weapons at the child. They then locked them in the bathroom, saying that if they tried to leave, they would be killed. My brother still remembers that moment. I only remembered that they locked us in the bathroom, and there was a huge racket outside. Before that, Mum was yelling from the upper floor to the street, shouting that we were being robbed. That's why they locked us in. I don't remember if the police came or not, but I do remember that one of the men had shut the door and stuck his hand through the gap, pointing a gun at us. Then, everything went quiet. They escaped in a car we had, and it was found later because They had crashed it. Meanwhile, the robbers took everything they could carry, TV, jewelry, valuables, whatever they could get their hands on. Then, they carried the loot to the car parked in the garage, loaded it up, and before leaving, took the car keys. I don't know how long exactly it took for my family to realize the intruders had gone. As soon as they could, they called the police, and from what I was told, the officers chased the car, a Volkswagen Caribe, through the streets of a neighborhood. In the end, the thieves tried to cross the median to escape, but crashed. The men abandoned the vehicle and ran away, and the police never caught any of them. Since that day, my family never felt safe in the house again. In fact, they moved to a safer city. Robberies continued in that same neighborhood and murders, even to nearby neighborhoods. But that day stayed etched in everyone's memory. Because having a gun pointed at you as a child really puts a deep sense of fear within you. A few nights ago, my roommate woke me up around 2 a.m. knocking frantically. I immediately knew something was wrong, and my feeling was validated as I walked into the living room and 4 cops were inside. They proceed to tell me that a man woke them up by turning on their light in their room, closing the door behind him, taking his shoes off and putting his keys on the table. My roommate, of course, told him to get out over and over, pleading with him. But he kept saying it was his house, this was the address he was given, and it was Macy's house and that Macy had let him in. He seemed to be high on something, but the scary thing is neither of us heard him get in. He took the screen off the window and crawled through. It was unlocked even though we thought it was locked. We have a bunch of trinkets on our windows, but nothing was broken or knocked over. How can you be so high? You think someone's house is your house, yet you're still fully in control of your body movements. When my roommate told him they were calling the cops, he simply went out to the living room and sat on the coffee table and waited for them to come. The only experience I personally have seeing him is when there was 1 police officer inside and 2 outside holding him. One of the officers opened the door to either get in or out, and without the slightest hesitation the man lunges at us. It's like he didn't care at all that there were 3 police officers holding him. I could hear him screaming all the way down the stairs. What is so eerie is that nothing was stolen or broken. He seemed to really think it was his house, but the story kept changing. I got in contact with his co-worker, who said he went out to the bars, but this cannot be just alcohol. If anyone has any idea of what drug this guy was on, please let me know. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Honestly, I find the topic of break-in stories incredibly disturbing. I read one a few years ago, to those of you who remember it, about the guy who broke into someone's home, and obviously he got away with it. And then a few weeks later, he actually sees the guy in the same building complex as him, and it turns out the guy had just moved in with his girlfriend there, and that just made everything worse. I can't remember how it ended, if he called the cops on him or something, but all the same, just the thought of someone being in your space is pretty damn disturbing. I actually had, not quite this, but a few weeks ago, our neighbors are, in their early 20s, and they like to go out and party. Well, what happened is, they went out, had their house keys, for some reason couldn't get into their house, and then jumped our fence and were in our garden trying to jump into their back garden from our garden. The problem is they couldn't do it. And when we heard the noise, I looked out the window and saw them, and I was shouting at them, "What are you doing?" And they just rushed off and climbed the fence again. But still, it's pretty horrifying just thinking that, someone could just climb into your fence and then, who knows, smash a window and get into your home. So yes, the fear is real. I hope you have enjoyed my rambles at the end of this episode. I would like to conclude by giving a big thank you to all of you, and especially my members and patrons, whose names can be seen on screen. As always, If you want to join their ranks and sign up, you do get some pretty cool rewards. Namely, tomorrow they get a special Haunted Hospital episode, so if that is something which you might find interesting, feel free to sign up. Info in the description. But until then, guys, I will see you on Thursday, when we will be returning to the Deep Woods. Stay awesome, my friends, and good night.